Okay, here we go. Chapter 5, Sweet Angeline. My mother was the only person in the world whom my father truly cherished and loved. They say opposites attract. That was certainly true of Sam Giancana and Angeline de Tolve. No two people could have been more different when they met. Sam, of course, was a three-star hellion, a street tough whose reputation as a leader of the 42s was well known both to the good families and to those whose values were somewhat shady. He was known as a thief, a boy who taunted shopkeepers, challenged the police, was a suspect in murders, and ran around with loose girls. The values of a strict Catholic upbringing were traditional among most immigrant Italians in the patch. They held little meaning for Sam, who by the age of 18 had probably violated all the Ten Commandments, not to mention the laws of society. Mother, on the other hand, came from a family steeped in the traditions of the Catholic Church. Grandma Maria and Grandpa Francescantonio de Volve came from a southern Italian region known as Basilicata. Grandma de Tolve was an orphan and had been raised in a convent in Italy before she came to the United States. It was in the convent where she learned embroidery, and it was probably from that background and her deep religious convictions that she provided each of her children with sheets embroidered with little red crosses. My mother was one of three daughters. Her sisters' names were Rose and Anna. The de Tolves had four sons: Joseph, Andrew, Michael, and Anthony. All were raised in the strict traditions of the church and the old Italian ways. Mother and her sisters, until they were 14, were educated at Our Lady of Pompeii parochial school by nuns who taught them to be devoted practitioners of the faith. As a young girl, Mama was very carefully watched over by her mother. Careful control of the movements, associations, and growth of their daughters was a de Tolve resolve. They were a poor but proud family who wanted to provide a future for their children. Their sons were also watched carefully, although the family strings were a bit looser. In any event, Grandpa de Tolve was extra careful not to allow his sons to become involved or mixed up with street gangs such as the 42s or with any of their members. When Grandpa de Tolve came to this country, he worked as a laborer in the construction industry, carefully saving his money to become a man of substance, a man of property. Among the construction projects he worked on was the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad station. On Saturdays and Sundays, he sold balloons to children in an area outside the patch. It was from this side occupation that he became known as the Balloon Grandpa. It was also from this extra job that Grandpa de Tolve earned considerable sums of money, enough to buy a 12-flat apartment house, which he maintained and from which he earned sufficient funds to educate his family and help his sons get into legitimate business ventures. In her youth, my mother was an outstanding athlete. She played softball, a not very common sport for young women of her time, and she was a remarkable swimmer. She became so good, in fact, that she was judged the top swimmer for her age group in Chicago, swimming across and back a major lake to win that distinction. Then, quite suddenly, her athletic prowess came to an end. Doctors discovered Mother had rheumatoid fever, a disease that caused damage to her heart and left her with a handicap that frequently resulted in illness and hospitalization and restricted her ability to raise her own children. Despite these limitations, despite the danger of too much physical exertion, which caused her to become bedridden, my mother managed to keep a spotless house. I remember quite clearly watching Mama, sick and weak as she was, spend hours scrubbing the kitchen floor, the windows, the cabinets, the stove, and the refrigerator. When she was through in the kitchen, she moved on to another room, scrupulously cleaning every nook and cranny until everything sparkled. When she wasn't cleaning, she was cooking, preparing full-course meals, beginning with homemade soups and appetizers, onto a wide variety of Italian dishes and salads, and finishing off with desserts of fresh, homemade pies. Her meals were prepared for the family, 5 of us after Francine was born, but somehow when Sam decided to bring friends to dinner, and that was quite often, Mama managed to stretch what she had and still satisfy everyone's appetite. More often than not, Mama was too exhausted to keep an eye on her children. Frequently I was sick, and more often I was in mischief. Francine had serious vision problems requiring doctors and special education. Only Bonnie was healthy and probably the most obedient of all of us. The net result was that I was farmed to aunts and uncles so that Mama could rest before Francine was born, and then I was sent to parochial boarding schools when I became of school age. The same was true of my sisters as they grew older. Mama did what she could, but frequently there were days when she needed rest, and relatives picked up the slack to ease her burden by babysitting one or more of us at their homes. Sam first met my mother before he began serving his major jail sentence on March 26, 1929, at Joliet State Penitentiary. He had been arrested by the Chicago police under the name of Sam Giancani. The charge was attempted burglary, but by the time he pleaded guilty, his name had been changed to Sam Giancana. This was not the first time he had been arrested. There had, of course, been the charge of murder mentioned earlier. He was indicted by a grand jury for that crime on September 17, 1926, but was never tried because of the murder or disappearance of or loss of memory by key witnesses. Police and FBI criminal records show that as a result of fingerprint identifications, my father was arrested under the name of Giancani on September 25, 1925. That charge was auto theft, and he was sentenced to 30 days in the Chicago House of Correction. He was just 17. In January 1926, he was fined $10 for motor vehicle larceny, and in June 1927 was found not guilty on another larceny charge. In January and March of 1928, Sam was found guilty and fined on 2 disorderly conduct charges. The year 1929 appears to have been his most eventful. On February 15th, he was accused of burglary and larceny, and 5 days later he was arrested again on charges of robbery. This was followed by a charge on March 12th of attempted robbery, which resulted in a jail sentence. It was this damning record of arrests and criminal activity that prompted Illinois Judge John J. Sullivan to sentence Sam to a term of 1 to 5 years in the toughest prison in Illinois, a penitentiary that took in veteran criminals who were not considered candidates for rehabilitation. Sam served 45 months inside Joliet, where some of Chicago's most notorious criminals served their time. Sam's criminal life was like a red flag in the face of an angry bull for a man like Grandpa DeTolve. Sam was the epitome of the street tough the DeTolves abhorred. He drove a sporty car, wore expensive and typical gangster-style clothes, including wide-brimmed hats. To the young women of the patch, men like that were exciting. They represented an adventurous flight from the parental discipline, poverty, and loneliness of their uneventful lives. For my mother, he had a strange fascination when he was introduced to her at a soda fountain. Mama talked to him on occasion when she was in the company of other girls. She even thought he was attractive and quite polite, but even the mention of his name at home drew a torrent of admonitions from her parents to steer a different course from his. Mama tried, but my father was persistent. He had already fallen for her. She was respectable, from a fine family, a young lady quite different from the girls he was used to being with. I suppose her aloofness and her family's strenuous opposition to him intrigued him even more. However, before he could really campaign for her attention, he went to jail. Between the time Sam went to prison and the time he returned to the patch, my mother had met a young man my family remembers only as Solly, and she had become engaged. Solly, it turned out, was one of Chicago's biggest jewel thieves. I'm not sure that the Tolves or my mother really knew that until later, after Solly was killed on New Year's Eve on an icy pavement in an automobile accident. Emotionally, my mother almost became a cripple. She saw no one, practically became a recluse in her home, and kept Solly's picture and mementos of the romance with her whenever she was. It was during this period in 1933 that my father was freed from prison, and when he learned of my mother's sorrow, began making low-key attempts to see her. Out of her loneliness, I was told by relatives, out of a need for some companionship and understanding from someone she knew outside the family, at first she agreed to see Sam and then go out with him under the proddings of friends of his whom she knew. From the beginning, Grandpa DeTolve threw every roadblock he could in the path of the budding romance. He made it abundantly clear to Sam that he didn't like him and didn't want him to go out with my mother. That didn't deter Sam, and in a way, it made Mother all the more rebellious. After all, Mother was a beautiful 24-year-old woman with as perfect a figure as one could ask for. Despite her fragile health caused by the rheumatic fever, she still swam. She danced and engaged in many strenuous activities, all designed to maintain her figure and rebuild her strength. Many boys wanted to date her, but none dared to chance a confrontation with a man like Sam. Because of Grandpa DeTolve's strenuous opposition, many of the dates between my mother and father took place clandestinely at the homes of her girlfriends. They all knew and liked Sam, and they all did their best to help the romance flourish. In the meantime, Sam stayed out of trouble with the police, although he continued his criminal activities in gambling and making illegal alcohol. My aunts and uncles told me that their romance followed a rocky course for months, with opposition from Mother's family causing the most problems. But by late July 1933, Grandpa de Tolve agreed to the marriage, and the wedding took place in church on September 23rd, 1933. By Mafia standards, it was a very modest wedding. Mother had a lovely but not particularly expensive white gown, a small wedding party, and a traditional Catholic ceremony. The cost of the wedding, which family members called a peanut wedding because of its size, and the reception at the de Tolve family home on Polk Street, were borne by my Aunt Rose de Tolve and her brother Joseph. To the bitter end, my grandparents refused to help at the wedding, even though they knew it was inevitable. From the day I understood what love was as a child, I knew there was a special relationship, a warmth between my parents that I didn't share, that only they felt, and I resented it. I suppose that resentment was a result of my being sent away to religious boarding schools, but even before then I had a sense of being left out. There is one thing I did share with them, and that is what I call the Last Supper syndrome. I really became aware of it as a teenager, but when I look back, I realized it was there whenever Sam was home and not in prison. As I think of those moments, it's as if my mother were the wife of a man who was totally involved in combat. Now he was coming home from the fighting, and there she was, looking at him with love and fear in her eyes, cheerfully serving him a sumptuous meal, yet at the same time realizing that when he walked out the door, he might never return. Every evening that he came home was like the triumphant return of the warrior with his family gathered around him. Each of his daughters, I, when I wasn't at school, Bonnie, and later my youngest sister, Francine, dressed up to greet him and eat with him. After dinner, he would dutifully spend a few moments with us, then go to his room, shower, change his clothes, kiss Mother, and leave, to spend the wee hours of the nights in the criminal field of combat, directing the operation of bookies, loan sharks, vice rackets, garbage and jukebox rackets, and in endless meetings with other leaders in the mob. In the period shortly after the birth of Francine, Sam would spend extra time with her. Francine was very special. Like me, she had been born prematurely and weighed less than 3 pounds. She was very frail and had eyesight was very poor. So bad, in fact, that she had to have special education. I found it rather amusing when reading FBI surveillance documents to find that the FBI reported that Francine was a retarded child. Nothing could have been further from the truth. Francine simply had bad eyesight, requiring special training that average parochial and public schools were unable to provide. Because of this handicap, and because of the fear in her early years that she might die, Francine was babied and coddled by Sam, yet even the time he spent with her was limited. Running a mob was never an 8-hour day. It was less his business than his life. For most of my parents' married life, there was never another woman for Sam. I say for most of their married life, because in later years, just before her death, Mama told me she knew Sam was having an affair with another woman, a blonde whom she never identified and whose identity I was never able to discover. But that took place only toward the end of their married life, and the blonde probably represented Sam's need as a mafioso to have a girlfriend just as his peers did. For members of the Chicago Mafia, having girlfriends was a mark of manliness, a badge of honor. Those who didn't were considered strange, men who couldn't be trusted. Very few of Sam's associates didn't have girlfriends on the side, but I must say that the ones whom I knew had them were very discreet for the most part. They didn't flaunt their relationships. They made an effort not to embarrass their wives and children. Sam was like that. Mama discovered the relationship only by accident when she overheard the wives of several of his mob friends talking about it at a charity affair. Mama never said a word of it to me until the day she died in West Palm Beach, Florida, on April 23rd, 1954, and then she said it in anger because I had talked about bleaching my hair to blonde. Only tramps have blonde hair, she shouted, like that woman your father's running around with. A year earlier, Mother had had to enter a hospital in Chicago for a hysterectomy. Sam was beside himself with worry about her. From the moment she entered the hospital, he went to extraordinary lengths to be by her side, to comfort her. As often as possible, he sat with her for hours at a time, holding her hand, speaking words of endearment, kissing her forehead, puffing up her pillows to ensure her comfort. In those moments, he showed a deeper love and concern than I had ever seen. Sam stayed with her day and night, and woe unto the nurse or doctor who suggested that he was there past visiting hours. Her room was always filled with fresh roses at the hospital and when she returned home. He went to Saks Fifth Avenue, and instead of buying one or two lovely negligees, he brought back three huge boxes of the most expensive and beautiful negligees and peignoirs I had ever seen. For weeks afterward, he showered her with all kinds of gifts: beautiful clothes, gorgeous jewels, religious artifacts. It was as if he had become transformed. Before she entered surgery, he was very comforting, very supportive, and for the first time I could remember, he prayed aloud for her safety in surgery. After the surgery, he was extraordinarily attentive and sympathetic over the slightest sign of discomfort. Sam had a terrible fear that Mother would die during surgery. It was then he realized and expressed openly just how much he cared for her and needed her. For months afterward, he stayed home with Mama more than he had in ages, and then as quickly as his attention to her began, it faded as he returned to the pressing needs of the mob he directed and to his girlfriend. As I look back on that period, I think what a hypocrite he was, and yet I am just as certain that he loved my mother as he loved no other woman, and he suffered deeply over her death for a long, long time. End of chapter.